You're a starship captain in an asteroid field. Blasting with your lasers or put up your shields. As a missile commander defending your city. If you're not quick enough, they'll show no pity. The invaders won't stop us from the skies they drop. Just keep coming. Everyone's gone Atari. The #1 video game.
Turn on the arcade. Hello everyone and welcome back to the arcade here on Player One Start. In the previous videos in this series, I took a look at Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and Asteroids. Each of those games were groundbreaking and have now been considered classic and iconic titles, and often games people think of when they hear the word video games. In my last video, I asked which one of these iconic titles you wanted me to cover next, and it was almost unanimously Missile Command. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the history and development of Missile Command, the arcade version, and its immediate home ports, as well as its legacy. So sit back, relax, get your tokens and quarters ready as we enter the arcade to play Missile Command. Back in the early days of Atari, video game developers were not credited with the games they invented. Instead, Atari was credited as the author, and the development team was considered the creator of each of the games. That was the standard practice at Atari at the time, and game programmers working at Atari were not happy with it. In fact, a group of Atari's employees would walk out and start their own development studio, with one of the main goals being that the game programmer get credit for their work. However, in the case of Missile Command, it was not a team effort, but mainly the work of one game programmer at Atari named Dave Theuer.
Missile Command, Steve Galfy, the software manager, called me into his office and said, Dave, we'd like you to work on a new game where the Russians are invading the US, and there's this radar screen and you can see the missiles coming in, and you have to defend the country. And he said, just think about that for your next game. And when I walked out of his office, my spine was just tingling because I knew that this was like, wow, this is like a great idea. This is going to be great, and it's going to be fun.
VP of Sales at Atari, Gene Lipkin, had seen a magazine news story about satellites that showcased a radar screen, and that caught his eye. Something about the visuals fascinated him and thought it would make a good game. Lipkin passed the magazine clippings to Steve Galfy, who put Theuer in charge of the project. The project was described as making a game where you have bases at the bottom of the screen, and you have trails of missiles coming in at you. The player would have to shoot the missiles down or intercept them in some way to try to save your bases. Theuer was enthralled with the idea of this project and very enthusiastically signed up. However, he had one reservation. He wanted to make sure that the game would only be a defensive game, and that players would not be dropping bombs on cities, as that would set the player in the position of being a genocidal maniac. He and junior programmer Rich Adam would set out to make the game. According to both developers, the game ended up being much more complicated than the simple design they initially started with. Partway through development, they decided to remove some of the game's features they had programmed in to make the game a bit more simplistic. For example, each of the bases had different names for each city. The cities were initially listed as Eureka, San Francisco, Santa Barbara, Los Angeles, and San Diego, 6 different major cities in California, which would also include where Atari's offices were located. Once they realized they had too much in the game, the first thing they did was drop the cities' names, leaving it up to the player to determine what they were defending. They also at one point had railroads that the players had to protect as well, which would carry missiles from factories to the military bases. This was meant to control the amount of ammunition available to the player, but in the end they found out it just complicated the gameplay too much and they removed it. The game Missile Command is born directly out of the conflict between the United States and the USSR that were locked in the battle of the Cold War between the two superpowers. Thurr would go on to state that Missile Command would embody the Cold War nightmare that they were living in at the time. An unintended consequence of developing this game was, as Thurr described, he would have intense nightmares. One of them he described as hiking in the mountains above the Bay Area with a fabulous view of the San Francisco Bay. Then he would dream he would see the missile streaks coming down and know the blast would hit him. He described it as a very sobering experience. But really, he attributed this to the fact that he was very involved in the development of the game, and it became his sole focus for the entire development period. The game was field tested, and one of the changes they made to the game is that they removed the light-filled panel at the top of the Missile Command cabinet above the player's head. The panel had flashing lights that served as status indicators for each of the in-game bases, but during the field test they found out that it distracted players too much, as they kept looking away from the screen to check their status lights. The solution ended up being just to chop off the whole top of the cabinet. As the game developer said himself, it saved the company a whole bunch of money, and it didn't hurt the gameplay. The game made its debut in the arcades in July of 1980, with Atari distributing it in the United States, but licensing it to Sega for Japan and European releases that same year. The game was an instant success in the arcades, eventually becoming the classic we know today. The arcade game is played by moving a crosshair across the sky via a trackball, and pressing one of the 3 buttons on the control panel to launch a counter missile from the appropriate battery. Counter missiles explode upon reaching the crosshair, leaving a fireball that lasts for several seconds, and destroys any enemy missiles that enter it. There are 3 batteries, each with 10 missiles. A missile battery becomes useless when all of its missiles are fired, or if it is destroyed by enemy fire. The missiles of the central battery can fly to targets at much greater speed, and only these missiles can kill a smart bomb at a distance. The game is staged as a series of levels of increasing difficulty. Each level contains a set number of incoming enemy weapons. The weapons try to attack the 6 cities, as well as the missile batteries. Being struck by an enemy weapon results in the destruction of the city or the missile battery. A level ends when all enemy weaponry is destroyed or reaches its target. If you run out of missiles, you no longer have control over the remainder of the level. At the end of each level, the player receives bonus points for any remaining cities or unused missiles. Between levels, missile batteries are rebuilt and replenished. Destroyed cities are only rebuilt once you reach a set level of points. Like most early arcade games, there is no way to win at this game, and it will keep going ever faster with more incoming missiles until the player is no longer able to defend their cities. When the player reaches this inevitable end, the screen displays "The End" rather than "Game Over," signifying that in the end, all is lost and there is no winner. The end screen is skipped, however, if the player makes the high score list, and the game prompts the player to enter the initials. And I think this is what always caught my eye in the arcades. Every once in a while passing by this machine and while it's going through its demo screens, you would see this "The End" flashing screen that catches your eye as you walk by it. And since I grew up in an arcade, where this game was already over 10 years old, I really think that was a good way to keep getting my attention, even though it was fighting against games above its weight class, such as Mortal Kombat and Super Street Fighter 2. Again, following the precedent set by Space Invaders, a home port of this game was not too far off, and it would be ported to the Atari 2600 in 1981. Perhaps to calm down the threat and high stakes of thermonuclear war, the game's instruction manual describes a war between 2 planets. I guess that way it was more of an alien war rather than something that could actually happen to the United States and the USSR. But anyway, as usual, how did Missile Command fare on the Atari 2600? To be honest, I still find this game very impressive that it is running on very less capable hardware. It actually looks like its arcade counterparts, and it performs quite admirably, again considering the system limitations. I think my biggest gripe with this game is that it is harder than heck to control that crosshair with the joystick. In fact, that's part of the reason why I bought the Atari Arcade 1-Up cabinet, because I could finally play Missile Command with a trackball, and I wouldn't have to spring for the huge amount just to get a Missile Command arcade cabinet. Again, as this was published during a time where Atari didn't credit the game developer, as an Easter egg, on level 13, if the player uses all of their missiles without scoring any points, at the end of the game, the city on the right will turn into the letters R and F, which are the initials of the programmer, Rob Fulop. Regardless, if I had gotten this game for my Atari 2600 back in the day, I would have been very happy with this, and the fact that I could play Missile Command in my home would have been something I would have looked forward to. But then came the Atari 8-bit version and an identical version for the Atari 5200 in 1982. This game not only looks more close to the arcade counterpart, it performs a bit better as could be expected on more capable hardware. But what makes this game even more enjoyable is the fact that you can play with the new trackball controller. Unfortunately, I do not have one of these in my collection, and they are harder than heck to track down. However, I did get the opportunity to play one at a game show, and I have been looking for one ever since. Despite the shortcomings of the 5200, I think this one would have been a must-have back in the day for this system. The same Atari 8-bit port was later used in the 1987 Atari XEGS as a built-in game that boots up if there's not a cartridge or keyboard in the console. There were enhanced versions of Missile Command released for the Atari Lynx and the Game Boy, again another great thing to have on the go. I do remember borrowing this from a friend back in the day and playing Missile Command on my Game Boy and being quite content with it, but the Atari Lynx version being in full color would have been something I would have loved to have had back in the day, and I'm still looking for my Atari Lynx to this day. An updated version called Missile Command 3D was released for the Atari Jaguar in 1995. This contains 3 versions of the game: Classic, which looks like an exact port of the arcade game, and in 3D mode the game is graphically upgraded with a rotating viewpoint, and in virtual mode, it was the only game that works with the virtual reality helmet from Virtuality. As with Asteroids, the game received a 3D remake for Missile Command that was released on Microsoft Windows and the Sony PlayStation in 1999. Missile Command also received an HD remake that was released via Xbox Live Arcade for the Xbox 360 on July 4th, 2007. When smartphones started taking off, Missile Command was one of the first games released on the iPhone and iPod Touch for a retail price of $5 on September 23, 2008. On March 26, 2020, Atari released a new remake called Missile Command Recharged and was released on mobile platforms. On May 27th, the remake also made its way to the Nintendo Switch, as well as home computers, via Steam. Later it was released as a launch title on the new Atari VCS, and an updated version of the game has been announced for when the Intellivision Amico finally releases. As with any successful game of the time, there were several different clones that were unofficially made for a variety of platforms, which included the game Missile Defense for the Apple II. There was the game Stratos in 1982 for the TRS-80. Repulsar was released in 1983 for the ZX Spectrum, and Barrage in 1983 for the TI-99-4A. Silas Warner, who would go on to create Castle Wolfenstein, programmed a clone for the Apple II called ABM, and clones even made their way into the next century, with Atomic Command, being a clone of Missile Command, being playable on the Pip-Boy interface in Fallout 4. As being one of the most popular arcade games of the 1980s, the game has been referenced several times throughout pop culture, but I think my favorite reference was in 1991, in Terminator 2: Judgment Day, where John Connor plays the arcade game, echoing the film's theme of a future global nuclear war. Overall, I feel that Missile Command deserves its place as an iconic arcade game title from the 1980s. The game takes a sobering look into the reality of the 1980s. The Cold War was a very uneasy time in history, and many people were well aware of the reality that could come one day, but thankfully did not. But anyway, what do you guys think of Missile Command, and where do you remember playing it the most? In the arcades, in one of the home ports, or on one of the clones? Go ahead and let me know in the comments below. I really look forward to seeing what your experience with this game has been. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A special thanks to those Patreons you see on screen. Also, if you like what you see, please remember to leave a like and click that subscribe button on your way out. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.